Today we're discussing the issue of terrorism, a form of political violence that has come to define the global politics of the early 21st century, with the 9/11 attacks, of course, and the ensuing war on terror. And even though the latter has receded in the background somewhat with the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, the resort to spectacular violence remains an enduring feature of modern media-driven societies. And that's what we're going to interrogate today. The logic of terrorism, what its motivations are, what its means and mechanisms are, how we might address the conceptualization of it and distinction that we might make between forms of violence that are terrorist and others that might not be. Indeed, it's no secret that there is a considerable contestation over the definition of terrorism, or at least the affixing of the label of terrorism. Terrorists themselves are generally defined simply by the attribution of acts of terrorism. And we, of course, have to deal with the difficulty that terrorism today as a label is essentially pejorative. It's used to critique, to undermine, delegitimize groups, and hence why it's used extremely abusively in the context of political discourse. No group today self-identifies as terrorism. As we'll see, in the early 19th century, to be a terrorist could be a badge of honor, a label that groups and individuals were willing to adopt. This is no longer the case today. The terrorist is always the other. And so, of course, this has led some to conclude that really we can't speak of any objective definition of terrorism, that, as the phrase goes, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And of course, we can, stop the conversation at this point. Simply note that terrorism is a rhetorical tool, and that really it's only it's a matter of subjective interpretation. I think this is quite unhelpful, really, approach. There's not to say that there's not a truth to the fact that terrorism, or the label of terrorism, is used often in a strictly rhetorical fashion. But it doesn't mean that we can't think somewhat rigorously about what terrorism means and what a terrorist act would be. In fact, I think this is where we have to begin. First of all, we have to address a certain number of potential difficulties or contentions. The first is that some would want terrorism to be exclusively non-state violence. This, I think, is problematic in the sense that very often the narrative or the history of terrorism notes that the very first invocation of terror is found in the context of the French Revolution, the period of the terror that was implemented between 1792 and 1794. So, more generally speaking, I think there is no inherent reason why we want to exclude states per se from the list of possible practitioners of terrorism. There's no, I think, fundamental reason for thinking that a state actor cannot conduct an act of terrorism. However, there is, I think, a problem in the sense that we tend to conflate then a whole range of acts of domestic political repression, war crimes, genocide, as end up being labeled as forms of state terrorism. And I think that is also unhelpful. If we make this category of terrorism so broad that every single crime committed by a state can be understood as terrorism, then we don't end up with a very intelligible concept of terrorism. Ultimately, I would submit that in order to grasp terrorism, we have to go back to its etymology and to think from the action itself. Terrorism obviously refers to terror because the logic of the terrorist act is the spreading of fear through an act of violence. That, I think, is very important for us to be mindful of, because one of the first implications it brings is that terrorism, the fear of a terrorist attack, really isn't in the attack itself. The fear comes from what might come after. In other words, every act of terrorism carries the promise of future attacks. That is, after all, what there is to fear. Something that has happened already can be horrifying and traumatizing, but it can't really be terrorizing. The so-called master of Hitchcock, the director Alfred Hitchcock, I think understood this very well when he explains that there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. Right? The fear comes from the expectation of the violent act, not the violent act itself. Now, of course, the use of fear has always been an aspect of war. At the very least, it's been a force multiplier. That's to say, troops have and armies have benefited from the fact that fear instilled in the heart of the enemy is likely to make an army more fearsome, more effective, if it is feared. So the pursuit of fear, of terror, has always had an appeal in war. And of course, we talked about nuclear weapons a few weeks ago, and in the case of nuclear weapons and of the strategy of deterrence, we saw that fear is at the very heart of it. Deterrence works precisely through a threat and ultimately a psychological effect, fear in the mind of the enemy that they might be attacked if they pursue a course of action that is being deterred. So where does this leave us? Well, we might say that terrorism is perhaps most clearly identifiable where the terrorizing impact is most disproportionate to the actual level of violence employed. So that many acts of violence may have a component of terror, but the characteristic of terrorism is precisely when that terror is most out of proportion with the use of violence. The French political theorist and strategist Raymond Aron, I think, sums it up very well here. A violent action is deemed terrorist when its psychological effects are disproportionate to its purely physical results. One way this could be thought of is that most terrorist acts involve, relatively speaking, not many people dying, but many people watching. Terrorism is ultimately a communicative act. It needs an audience. It is the use of killing and of violence to impress an audience. Martha Crenshaw puts it as follows: terrorist violence communicates a political message. Its ends go beyond damaging an enemy's material resources. The victims or objects of terrorist attack have little intrinsic value to the terrorist group, but represent a larger human audience whose reaction the terrorists seek. So again, the real target of a terrorist attack is the audience who will be terrorized. Now, that's not to say that the choice of immediate physical target is not irrelevant. In fact, generally speaking, it's the object of very careful deliberations by terrorists. And there's really a whole gamut of potential targets that can be seen in terrorist attacks. For instance, there might be individual assassinations targeted at very specific individuals. There might be attacks on members of the armed forces or the security institutions or the police, representatives, of course, of the state's monopoly of violence. These individuals may not have been chosen for their specific identity, but for the position they have within the institutions of the state. We also see attacks directed towards physical infrastructures, towards symbolic buildings or locations. Finally, we have seen certain terrorists pursue attacks in a largely, essentially indiscriminate fashion. That's to say, they seem to seek maximum civilian casualties and pay very little heed to the identity of these victims, be they children, women, of any sort of confession or identity, and so forth. All of these, of course, approaches convey a particular and distinct message, and of course this has to do with the symbolic dimension, the communicative dimension of terrorism, and we'll explore some of these further in a moment. But one thing perhaps just to discuss for now is to think about in what sense terrorism, or for what reason terrorism appears as a specifically modern phenomenon. It's a concept and a notion that comes to the fore fairly recently. As we said, the term is coined in the French Revolution, but really terrorism only emerges as a category we would recognize in the late 19th century. So why then? What is it about modern societies that makes terrorism appealing or effective? It might have something to do with the arrival of mass politics, the fact that we live in societies in which governments have to be responsive to the feelings of wider populations. And so creating senses of fear in the population is liable to put considerable pressure on governments and officials. And in this sense, of course, it may account for the reason why democracies, or at least the claim that democracies are soft targets for terrorism, because democracies are particularly responsive to their populations. A second aspect of modern societies would have to be the media, or the increasing role of the media. As I've already said, the terrorism requires an audience, and of course for that it needs or benefits from media, from the ability to communicate, report, diffuse the actions that terrorist organizations perpetrate. So of course the late 19th century, when terrorism starts to develop, is of course an area where mass print starts to arrive. Newspapers become very powerful. And we've seen continuously throughout the 20th century the ways in which the media has become a very powerful relay for terrorist action, whether it's television or today the internet. Again, in a pre-media society, an act of terrorism would receive much less echo. It might be witnessed by a certain number of people perhaps, and then it would have to go communicate itself by word of mouth, but that's a far less efficient process, of course, for propaganda and for diffusion than societies where mass media is prevalent. There is also, of course, the role of technology, or weapons technology if you want, and the development of modern high explosives has played a significant role. Albert Parsons, an anarchist tried for a bombing in 1886, explained at his trial that dynamite makes all men equal and therefore free. It's quite a radical idea. He's saying that the dynamite, this compressed explosive that any man can yield, creates a radical equality. Everyone is able to deploy this power, this force, this violence, and no one can be invulnerable in the face of it. I mean, this I think stands in more generally for the ways in which the means of technological violence have continuously made violence and this very destructive levels of violence more available to individuals or to small groups. You do not need to have an army of thousands and thousands of men to be able to cause significant carnage. Finally, we might note that modern terrorism has always made a considerable use of transport infrastructures or vehicles in either targets or as mobilized weapons. We might think about the ways in which terrorist organizations have privileged the targeting of trains, planes, buses, or how they have used these vehicles as weapons. The 9/11 planes, of course, were converted into missiles. The adoption by Islamic State of trucks and cars for the conduct of terrorist attacks, in which these vehicles were used to run over civilians. Now, historically, if we look at in a brief way at the span of terrorism, we could fall back on David Rappaport's suggestion of 4 historical waves of international terrorism. The first of this is the anarchist wave that takes form in the late 19th century and gains momentum in the last decade of the 19th century. It's a fairly international movement across Europe, motivated by anarchist beliefs, who decide to use terrorist violence as a way to bring down state societies. It broadly comes to an end in the first decade or so of the 20th century, partly through state repression and finally with the outbreak of the First World War. Secondly, we have an anti-colonial wave that takes shape around the 1920s and runs into the 1960s. And a variety of groups in this period use terrorism as part of their campaigns to gain independence from colonial powers. So we see the Irish, we see Zionist movements, and we see, for example, the Algerians in the war, the Algerian war against the French, all resort to terrorism as one of the means by which to attain independence, all of which ultimately do so. Here in the image we have a report of the attack on the King David Hotel in 1947 by a branch of related to the Zionist movement. Then from the 1960s and onto the 1980s, we have the new left wave, which is dominated by a variety of organizations in Western Europe and in the United States, who are motivated by revolutionary fervor, who want to bring about the end of capitalism in the West, and who resort to spectacular acts of violence to do so. I mean, the organizations that are significant here are the Italian Red Brigades, the German Baader Meinhof, the American Weather Underground. Finally, we have the religious wave. And here we might think of something that spans the 1980s until largely the present day. This wave, of course, is largely associated today with the Islamist jihadist vein of terrorism. But of course, in 1995, very high-profile attacks in Japan were conducted by the cult Aum Shinrikyo, including a poison gas attack on the Japanese subway. And for many, prior to the war on terror, it announced a new era of terrorism, which would be dominated by religious actors. So we have these 4 broad waves. They overlap in significant ways. There's not a strict chronology to them. But nonetheless, they are, I think, broadly helpful in terms of thinking through the history of it and the various kinds of movements that have adopted these means. These waves exist on a broadly generational duration, so they end up petering out. As to whether the religious wave will peter out or has petered out already, or is petering out, I think that remains certainly open to question. But it's a useful, as I say, first brush for thinking about the history of terrorism.